Long before the first European ship sliced through the Pacific waves, before kingdoms rose and vanished across the world, an ancient land stood silent at the edge of the earth. This was Australia, a continent shaped by fire, drifting continents, and deep isolation. And here, tens of thousands of years ago, humanity arrived. But these were not ordinary settlers. They were the first Australians, ancestors of today's Aboriginal peoples, who reached the land at least 65,000 years ago, making them one of the oldest continuous cultures on Earth. To survive in this vast and unpredictable environment, they mastered the land in ways the world still struggles to understand. They read the direction of the wind by watching grass bend. They found water in barren deserts where outsiders would only see death. They shaped grasslands using controlled fire, turning nature into a finely tuned system. And above all, they built a spiritual universe known as the Dreaming, a network of creation stories that explained every river, mountain, star, and rule of life. These people weren't wanderers, they were scientists, artists, engineers of fire and earth. Their rock paintings, some older than the Egyptian pyramids, still glow faintly in caves, telling stories of giant ancestral beings and ancient hunts. Their trade routes carried ochre, shells, weapons, and stories across thousands of kilometers. For over 60 millennia, they lived without invasion, without conquest, without foreign empire. The world changed, civilizations rose and collapsed, but this land remained theirs. Everything shifted when the first strange ships appeared on the horizon, sails glistening, masts towering, carrying men who believed they had discovered an empty land. They had no idea what history they were about to interrupt. The first European to stand on Australian soil wasn't British, but Dutch. In 1606, Willem Jansen landed on the northern shores, confused by the unfamiliar landscape and wary of its people. After a violent encounter with indigenous groups, he left quickly, marking Australia as dangerous and unwelcoming. Other Dutch explorers followed: Dirk Hartog, Abel Tasman, mapping coasts but avoiding settlement. To them, New Holland was too harsh, too empty, too strange. For more than a century, Europe forgot the continent. But in 1770, a ship named HMS Endeavour sailed toward destiny. On its deck stood Captain James Cook, a skilled navigator tasked with exploring the Pacific. When he reached Australia's east coast, he saw green hills, wild forests, and coastlines full of life. Cook believed he had discovered a land of opportunity. He charted every bay and river he could find, including Botany Bay, where he first stepped ashore and made contact with the indigenous people. Cook misunderstood much. He assumed the land belonged to no one. He believed agriculture was possible everywhere. He believed indigenous peoples lived simple lives without ownership of land. His reports, shaped by imperial ambition, traveled back to London like sparks landing on dry wood. Britain was desperate: overcrowded prisons, rising crime, no place to send convicts after losing American colonies. Cook's glowing descriptions offered a solution: a perfect place for a penal colony. He had set history in motion. Soon, Britain would send ships, soldiers, convicts, and a new chapter of Australia would begin, one filled with hardship, conflict, survival, and transformation. On a cold morning in 1787, as Britain struggled with overflowing prisons and rising crime, 11 ships gathered at Portsmouth. They carried soldiers, sailors, supplies, and hundreds of convicts chained below deck. This armada would be remembered as the First Fleet, a journey of nearly 25,000 kilometers into the unknown. No colony had ever been attempted so far from home. For many on board, it felt like a one-way trip to the edge of the world. After 8 brutal months at sea, storms, disease, hunger, and death, the fleet finally reached Botany Bay in January 1788. But the land Cook had praised from a distance proved harsh and unsuitable for settlement. The soil was poor. Fresh water was scarce. Tension with indigenous Australians rose quickly, as the newcomers camped on land that had been cared for by Aboriginal communities for thousands of years. Captain Arthur Phillip, understanding the danger, moved the fleet north and discovered a sheltered cove with deep water and fresh streams. He named it Sydney Cove, and on January 26, 1788, he raised the British flag, an act that would forever reshape the continent. But the early colony was far from the paradise Cook had imagined. Crops failed in unfamiliar soil. Tools broke. Food supplies dwindled. Many convicts had no farming skills. Starvation loomed over the settlement like a shadow. The colony survived only because of rationing, leadership, and occasional help from indigenous groups who shared fish and knowledge of the land. Despite all hardship, the colony refused to die. Convicts built roads, huts, and storehouses. Soldiers protected the fragile settlement. And slowly, the British grip tightened. But with each hut built and each tree cut down, conflict grew. Two worlds had collided, one ancient and spiritual, the other ambitious and expanding. And the struggle for Australia's future was only beginning. As the British colony at Sydney Cove grew, a far deeper struggle began, the collision of two civilizations. One was ancient and spiritual, the other was ambitious and expanding. Their meeting was anything but peaceful. To Indigenous Australians, the newcomers brought chaos. Strangers cut sacred trees, fenced hunting grounds, and built roads across ancestral pathways. The British claimed the continent as terra nullius, empty land, a belief that ignited the first sparks of conflict. Hunting grounds vanished, water holes were polluted, and diseases like smallpox devastated entire communities. But Indigenous people did not accept loss in silence. Warriors rose across the continent. In New South Wales, Pemulwuy, a fearless Bidjigal leader, launched daring attacks on farms and military posts, using his deep knowledge of the land to evade capture. He became a symbol of resistance, a man fighting to defend a world thousands of years old. As settlers pushed inland, frontier wars erupted. Farms were raided, reprisals followed, and violence shaped early Australian history. Yet even in conflict, moments of understanding appeared. Some settlers learned Indigenous languages, while some Indigenous groups adapted new tools and strategies. But Britain's population kept rising, and pressure on Indigenous lands grew unbearable. A transformed Australia was emerging, built on conflict, survival, and resilience. As the early colony found its footing, a powerful hunger began to grow, the desire to explore the unknown heart of Australia. To the British, the continent was a giant mystery. Maps showed only the coastline, the interior was a blank space, rumored to be deserts, forests, or maybe even an inland sea. Curiosity turned into ambition, and soon, explorers pushed beyond the safety of Sydney in search of land, resources, and answers. One of the earliest breakthroughs came in 1813 when Blaxland, Lawson, and Wentworth crossed the rugged Blue Mountains, a barrier that had blocked expansion for decades. Their discovery of fertile plains opened the floodgates. Settlers, farmers, and livestock surged westward, occupying vast territories that had been home to Indigenous nations for millennia. Explorers like Matthew Flinders then circled the entire coastline, giving the continent its name, Australia. Others went inland. Charles Sturt chased the myth of an inland sea. Thomas Mitchell mapped river systems and praised the land as perfect for settlement. And in one of the most dramatic expeditions, Burke and Wills attempted to cross the continent from south to north. Their journey ended in tragedy, but it symbolized the determination and the peril of exploring this harsh land. Every new discovery brought opportunity for settlers but disaster for Indigenous communities. Sacred sites were taken. Hunting grounds became farms. Entire nations were pushed aside without treaties or compensation. As sheep and cattle spread, frontier conflicts intensified, and the landscape began to change forever. Yet, exploration also revealed the continent's true identity, its deserts, mountains, rainforests, and vast plains. The world now saw Australia not as a distant penal colony, but as a land of immense potential. A new chapter was emerging, one driven by gold, migration, and the birth of cities that would transform Australia into a rising force on the global stage. In the 1850s, one discovery shook Australia to its core: gold. When Edward Hargreaves found gold near Bathurst in 1851, news spread like a storm. Within months, thousands rushed into the colonies, sailors fled ships, farmers left fields, and fortune seekers from China, America, and Europe flooded the landscape. Australia changed almost overnight. The goldfields were wild, crowded, and unpredictable. Camps grew into rough towns filled with tents, markets, and noise. Rivers sparkled with miners searching for treasure. Some became rich instantly, others dug in vain. But one thing was clear: the population exploded, transforming Australia from a penal settlement into a growing multicultural society. Tensions rose quickly. Mining licenses were expensive and inspections harsh. In 1854, frustration erupted at Ballarat, where miners built the Eureka Stockade, demanding fairness and justice. The rebellion was brief, but it forced major reforms: lower license fees, political rights, and a louder voice for the common people. Many consider Eureka the spark of Australian democracy. The gold boom triggered enormous growth. Railways stretched across the land, banks opened, and cities like Melbourne became some of the richest on earth. Chinese migrants built thriving communities and added new culture and trade, even while facing discrimination. But the gold rush also carried a heavy cost. Indigenous lands were overrun, sacred areas destroyed, and ancient communities pushed into deeper struggle. By the late 1800s, the colonies stood transformed, wealthier, more diverse, and more confident. Australia was preparing to unite and shape its own national destiny. By the late 1800s, Australia was no longer a scattered set of colonies, it was a continent filled with booming cities, expanding railways, and a growing sense of identity. People began asking a bold question: why not unite and become one nation? For decades, each colony had run its own laws, taxes, and immigration controls. But as trade increased and communication improved, the idea of federation gained strength. Leaders from across the colonies gathered to debate what a united Australia should look like. They studied the U.S. Constitution, examined Canada's system, and argued fiercely about borders, rights, and power. Most importantly, they wanted a nation built on democracy, one that protected freedoms and gave ordinary people a voice. After years of negotiations, public votes, and political battles, the dream became reality. On January 1, 1901, the 6 colonies, New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, South Australia, Western Australia, and Tasmania, joined to form the Commonwealth of Australia. Fireworks lit the skies. Bells rang across cities. A new nation had been born. The first years of federation focused on building systems that would shape Australia's future: a federal parliament, national laws, defence forces, and a strong focus on workers' rights. Australia introduced one of the world's earliest systems of social protections and championed voting rights, though tragically, these rights were denied to Indigenous Australians for decades. Immigration policies were also shaped during this time, including the infamous White Australia policy, which restricted non-European migration. It created opportunities for some, but injustice for others, especially Chinese, Pacific Islander, and Indigenous communities. Despite its challenges, federation marked a turning point. Australia now had a united voice, a growing pride, and the foundation of a modern nation. Ahead lay 2 world wars, sweeping social change, and a long journey toward justice and equality. The 20th century challenged Australia in ways that reshaped the nation forever. When World War I erupted in 1914, the young federation stood beside Britain. More than 400,000 Australians fought in Europe and the Middle East, and on the tragic shores of Gallipoli, where the bravery of Anzac soldiers forged a lasting identity built on resilience and unity. 2 decades later, World War II struck even closer. Japanese forces drove through the Pacific, and for the first time, Australian soil came under attack with bombings in Darwin. Australia strengthened ties with the United States, forming a partnership that would shape the region for decades. Women filled factories, cities mobilized, and the nation learned the power of collective effort. After the war, Australia opened its doors to migrants from Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Millions arrived: workers, survivors, and dreamers, reshaping the population into a vibrant multicultural society. Industries expanded, cultures blended, and a modern identity took shape. At the same time, the nation confronted its historical injustices. Indigenous Australians, long denied rights and recognition, fought for equality. The 1967 referendum, granting the federal government authority to legislate for Indigenous people and include them in the census, marked a turning point. Land rights movements and reconciliation efforts pushed the country toward a more honest understanding of its past. Today, Australia stands as a diverse democracy shaped by ancient cultures, colonial struggle, global conflict, and generations of migration. Its story continues to evolve, written by every voice that calls the continent home.